Good evening and welcome everyone to the shiur on Panorama of Halocho. This week is Parshas Naso, Shin Pei Beis. Today's shiur is dedicated by one of our very regulars, by Birkas Kohanim, in honor of his wife Sarah Shoshana Bas Chayadina, and the schus should have a refuah shlema. Incidentally, it's also my mother's birthday tonight. Rivka Bas of Rov of Anash. Okay, let's start with something which is not la halacha, but it's very, very interesting development here. So the minhag is to have milchiks on the Shavuos, and one of the reasons is got to do with Matan Torah. The Yidden weren't able to have fleishiks, and therefore switched to therefore they switched to milchiks. So Matan Torah, as we know, was on a Shabbos. So there's a lady by the name of Malka who had a special relationship with the Rebbe, and that was over many, many years. And she once asked the Rebbe, what did they have for milchiks? Was it Cholov Yisroel? Because the milk from yesterday was milked by non-Jews, because they weren't Yidden yet. Today, after Matan Torah, well, the milk which they're going to milk today is not Cholov Yisroel. Sorry, no. If they milk after Matan Torah, well, you can't milk after Matan Torah because it's Shabbos. You don't have to milk on Shabbos. So the Rebbe says to her that since the day of Matan Torah was a Shabbos, but it wasn't a full Shabbos, there is a svara that it wasn't binding, that they were allowed to do melacha because it's not a whole Shabbos. Shabbos is only when it's a whole, but if it's a part of a Shabbos for the whole of Klal Yisrael, then it's not binding. Therefore, they were allowed to milk the cows on Shabbos. So Malka says to Rebbe, I have a different suggestion. Perhaps the milk which they had milked the day before Matan Torah, although it wasn't Cholov Yisroel, but it was like, imagine you have absolute confidence, like what they call now Cholov Stam, the government regulations. You know that it's Cholov Yisroel. Sorry, you know that it's Cholov of a cow. It's not Cholov Yisroel because it wasn't watched. The milking wasn't watched by a Yid. But you know that it's milk from a cow. So therefore, perhaps they used yesterday's milk, which was not Cholov Yisroel, it was Cholov Stam. And the Rebbe says to her, this is so beautiful, the Rebbe says, amongst the 600,000 Yidden, for sure amongst them were some Chassidish Yidden, Yerei Shemayim, who wouldn't use Cholov Stam. They'd only use Mamash Cholov Yisroel. And to say that we celebrate every year that we have milchiks on Shavuos because Yidden then use Cholov Stam, that's a bit difficult to accept. And therefore the Rebbe went into this very interesting chiddush of that half a day of Matan Torah, a half a Shabbos doesn't count as a proper Shabbos. Now, this is what she said, and exactly what she heard is not anything, it's not muga. But here you have a Nukutasichas Chelik Ches, and the Rebbe addresses this. Well, let's give it a couple of minutes. It's Chelik Ches, it says, actually a sikha on this week's Sedra. Talk about the mitzvah Shabbos. When the mitzvah of Shabbos was given at Sinai. So the mitzvah of Shabbos, which was given at Moro a couple of weeks earlier, was kind of suspended, and now it's a new mitzvah. And therefore, says the Rebbe, therefore the previous hours of Shabbos until Matan Torah become like a weekday. And as a result, and let's read his inside, and the Vibaltas Edom says, therefore he says, then come doch ois as the shos shel achre Matan Torah are nicht gewed Shabbos. That even the hours after Matan Torah were not a full Shabbos because it wasn't a full Shabbos. So this which Malka was saying, which she heard from the Rebbe, orally, was this very similar to the discussion which the Rebbe has here in the Vesicha. I'm going to give it a couple of more minutes because it's such a fascinating idea. Just wanted to give you the date. I checked up the date of the Sikha is from Tofshin Chavov, and it's in every likelihood it was a similar time when she had this conversation with the Rebbe. All right, so now on this point about the Shabbos not being a binding Shabbos because it wasn't a full 24 hours. So there you see the 47 with the star, which was the way that Rebbe would add, 47 and a star, which the Rebbe would add notes in the second checking, he would add, there would be with asterisks. With this idea that the Shabbos of Matan Torah was not fully binding because it was only half a Shabbos, now we can understand the reason of Godel Echad, which is quoted in the Mishnah at the end of Tov Tzadik Dalet. And the Mishnah says it's a Tam Nochin. Why do we have milchiks and Shavuos? Zeichel Ozeh, that after Matan Torah, Shlach Matan Torah, the Bosor, if they wanted to have meat, they would have to have a big hachona to shecht and to cook. And therefore, because it was such a big geschäft, therefore they kept to the eating milchiks. L'chayre, why does the Godel Echad, the Mishnah say that to make fleishiks would be a whole big new geschäft, a whole big bother? You could have said it because it was Shabbos. And therefore it's also to shecht the whole day. As indeed this sefer is brought in the sefer to move as zatam zeh b'shem sefer Gulas Yisroel. So the sefer Gulas Yisroel, you have it over here. It's a sefer which has got traders from the Kitchever and others. And he says they couldn't shecht in the sefer Gulas Yisroel. They couldn't shecht on that day because it's Shabbos. And yet, here let's read the Mishnah Berurah. Ani mashamati oid b'shem Godel Echad she'om atam nochin lozeh. But when they were at Matan Torah, the Kiblu HaTorah, now you've got to start saying, in Aseres HaDibros, it doesn't talk about kosher or not kosher. The whole Torah was given to them in capsule form. As written by Reb Sadia Gaon, the Aseres HaDibros incorporate the whole Torah. Rashi mentions this in Chumash, as we know, that the Aseres HaDibros have got 620 letters corresponding to the entire Taryag mitzvahs, etc. And so he says, this Godel Echad says, they went from the Yordim in Hahor, they went from the mountain to the house, they didn't have what to eat right away, they only milchiks, but fleishiks, they would have to start shechting with a new knife, which was checked as a kasher tzivcha Hashem, and they'd have to start porging the chalev, and they'd have to start rinsing and desalting and cooking in new kalim, because the old kalim were also. Therefore, they went for quickly, to make things quicker, they had milchiks. So what the Rebbe is saying, underpinning this this reason quoted the Mishnah Berurah, doesn't say who the Godel Echad was, but underpinning that is an understanding that they were allowed to do malacha on that Shabbos. Because in Gemara says, everyone agrees that Shabbos did the Torah, and this is the Rebbe is saying, this svara, that since that Shabbos was only a half Shabbos, it wasn't the entire 24-hour of the new Shabbos. It wasn't a full of the old Shabbos. And as a result, they were allowed to do malacha. So yeah, therefore they were allowed to milk the cows fresh. Really, they could have, and you see the wording of the Mishnah, they could have really shechted also, but it would have been a much bigger bother to start shechting, and therefore they kept for milchiks. Okay, I found this very interesting, and all right, let's move on. When was Cholov Yisroel introduced? That's a very good question, but we know that it was introduced, it says in Rabbanon, obviously, L'chayre, Anshe Knesset Agdola or thereabouts, but we know that even that Avraham Avinu, the others kept in the din of Erev Yichanas Pnei Ha'ir, they kept the din of Erev. So the others kept the Isurim Rabbanon also, Mrs. Rabbanon. Okay. Now I'm going to share with you what I was bothering me on Shavuos, having gone through the Tikun Leil Shovuos, and I was bothered about the order of the Mishnayos. I've been bothered every year, but now I decided to do a bit of homework. Okay, so the order of the Mishnayos is after let's say Seder Moed, Shabbos Erevin. Then goes Psachim Shkolim, Yom Asuk Be'er Rosh Hashanah Tas Megillah Moed Mikol Chagiga. In the Tikun Leil Shovuos, the order is different. It's Psochim, Chagigo, Moed Cotton. Sorry, Beyo, Moed Cotton, then Rosh Hashanah Yom HaSukkah, Tan is Shkolim, and Megillah is the last. And then he goes to the other changes also in Seder Noshim and in Seder Taharis. So I was intrigued, why is there this change? I was going through my mind, perhaps the Yerushalmi is a different order, but I didn't do my homework on that. So I found that there's a sefer called Matamim, and there's a second Madura called Matamim HaChodosh. So either Matamim HaChodosh on the listing on the Shavuos, he discusses this, and he says that the order of the Mishnayos as done by Rabbeinu HaKodesh, which is often addressed in the Gemara. Why is this after that? At the beginning of Gemara Soita, why is Soita coming after Nazir, etc.? Many times the Gemara does explain the sequence. Also, you look in Pirush Mishnayos, the Rambam, he always explains the sequence of the Masechtas. That seems to be more a hierarchy sequence, whereas here, he says it's a chronological sequence. And therefore, after Psochim, he says, therefore, comes Chagiga, because you do Korban Chagiga together with the Korban Pesach. Pesach is a Yom Tov, so you have Beya, which is the dinim of Yom Tov. Pesach also includes Chalamoid. Therefore, you're talking about Me'ed Cotton, which is Chalamoid. After we've dealt with Pesach, with Yichas Yom Tov and Yichas Chalamoid, then goes Rosh Hashanah Yom HaSukkah, chronologically. Then comes Tainus. Tainus is primarily talking about fast for when there's a lack of rainfall. When do you have a lack of rainfall? When is that relevant? After Sukkot is coming into winter. Cheshvan, Kislev, that's the time when they were worried, when they needed to have the rain. Therefore, Tainus comes after Sukkot. After that comes Shkolim, because Shkolim, we know, Rosh Chodesh Adar, they started collecting the Shkolim for the new budget for Rosh Chodesh Nisan. After Rosh Chodesh Adar, then comes Megillah. So that's the explanation. It's going through the chronological, the order of the year. That's the explanation over here. He also explains the other changes, but I don't want to take the time here now. I'm giving you the address. It's in the Sefer Matamim HaChodosh, and you can look it up and enjoy. Let's move on. Okay. Last week, we had a discussion about a brother and sister acting together as Kvater. And someone called me out on this one. Doesn't seem to be logical. And actually, I'm inclined to agree with him. I took this from the Sefer Psochim Shavuos. And as you can see, his source says one should not be Kvater together with an aunt, with a mother-in-law. Father and daughter is okay. In the note, he says, but he hasn't got ample backing in the poskim. Now, what's the issue here? Here is a man and a woman who should not be having a close, affectionate contact. That's the issue. So a father and daughter, that is permitted. A mother and a son is permitted. But someone with his aunt, certainly with his mother-in-law, no difference in sense of certainly, but more obvious. So they are not allowed to have affectionate contact. What about a brother and sister? Are they allowed to have affectionate contact or not? And I'm going to address this because I think there's a lot of amaratis about this. So let's read some Pashat from Shulchan Aruch. This is a Shulchan Aruch, as a Siman Chof Aleph. It's basically the Lashon of the Rambam in Isur Bia, which Perek it is, whatever. So he says the following: one who embraces or kisses one of the erroneous, one of the close relatives. There's nothing lewd about that. He doesn't feel any way that way. His adult sister, his aunt. It's purely expressing, for your family. You're not. There's no. Let's use the word lewd. Kavana over here. Hareze megune beyoyse. Bedovor osuhu umase tipshim Yeah, he says it's forbidden. Now, there's a famous story in the Gemara about Ula who would kiss his sister's hand, and that same Gemara tells the story. The conclusion says it's not okay, and Ula himself accepted it was wrong. So the halacha remains. This is a Shulchan Aruch that it's not allowed with achoisoi hagdoil, an adult sister. Of course, with a younger sister, where do you draw the line? But an adult sister, certainly a married sister, then one should not have affectionate contact. Then he says, Ketzat, a father and daughter, mother and son, that's okay, Ketzat. Your father is allowed to embrace his daughter, Lanashka, to kiss her. And even to sleep in bed together. And a mother with her daughter. And here he adds on, though, this is only whilst they're young. Once the child starts growing older, then that's not allowed. Give some more detail. Now, here, the question, there's an ambiguity here. It started saying that a father is allowed to embrace the daughter and allowed to sleep in bed together. But once they grow older, you're not allowed to. Those they're not allowed to once they grow up. Does it also apply to the embracing? Or is it only in relation to the sleeping in the bed? So it's ambiguous. And now let's read on the next slide. This is the Rambam. I think everyone's got through this last year, 2 years ago. But this is the Rambam Pirush Mishnayos in the head. He has a lot of discussion. The Rambam wrote his Pirush Mishnah. Don't forget, there was no Shulchan Aruch then. People learned Mishnah, and he wrote it in Arabic for the simple people to be able to have a halacha l'maisa from learning whilst they were learning Mishnah. So a lot of things, and also a lot of values. A lot of the values which he discusses also in Sefer Yad, even Mer Nevuchim, he addresses them in the Pirush Mishnayos. So that's why you have like the Shmona Prokim in Ovis, etc. So here in it's a Peg Zayin head. So this is a mother is allowed to kiss her son, till the son is 12 years old. The father is allowed to kiss his daughter and embrace her until she's 9 years old. So the Rambam has put a limit. When it says father with a daughter and a mother with a son, it's only talking about when they're minors. That's the way the Rambam Pirush Mishnayos. In Sefer Hayad, the Mishnah Torah, he does not give those details. Furthermore, looking in Shulchan Aruch and Simchaf Aleph, so we look at here, we've got the Prisha. The Prisha is a commentary on the Tur. He says the following: Ha'av muter lechabik v'nashik es bitoy, neither da'afil k'shehi g'doy lo muter. The wording implies that even once the daughter is an adult, it is permitted to have affectionate contact, since it says with achos hagdoilo, you're not allowed to. And then he says father and daughter is allowed to, and therefore that means even when she's an adult. It says because man shehim ktanim, that which it says that only when the daughter is or the son is a minor. That's talking about lishonei moim b'kiravos, of being in bed close by. But the first part of having affectionate contact. So the Prisha, in other words, we have a Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos who says it's not allowed, and we have a Paisik in early Achronim who says it is allowed. Fine. Now let's come back then. Coming back then, utter brother and sister, father and daughter, and a son and his mother. So there seems to be no restriction at all. Let's say like the Prisha. But a brother and sister should not be having affectionate contact. As a result, they shouldn't be like with an aunt, like with a brother-in-law. It should be the same halacha. They shouldn't be being Kvater together. That's the way I understand. I don't see any difference in the halacha between the restrictions of affectionate relationship with an aunt and with an adult sister. That seems to be the. Now, someone is putting here on that on the chat that there is in the Igros Kodesh that a son is allowed to. It's permitted for a son who's an adult to have affectionate contact with his mother. Thank you very much, and I'm sure in due course we'll have a Maramokim on that. But fine, thank you. So in other words, we're following the Prisha, which is the Pshat in Shulchan Aruch. Although the Rambam is, as we see, the Rambam Pirush Mishnayos is strict. Okay, fine. someone sent me, unrelated to this question about the Kvater, possibly it was, when they saw the shiur from last week, may a divorced couple be Kvater? There's a grandchild who's having a bris. Unfortunately, the grandparents are divorced. They're both in town. Could they be Kvater? Now, I don't have a mefurish psak on this, but there are clear guidelines that a divorced couple, a man and woman who are divorced, should not be having business dealings with one another. Of course, it's inevitable they're going to have to deal with the custody kind of stuff, access, and all that kind of stuff. They're going to have a degree of conversation, but they should not be having business contacts, etc. Just to make life easier. I've taken, this is from Shulchan Aruch Even Ezra, again, Kufyu test. The quote which you have on the screen is from the Aruch HaShulchan, where he says, well, really the same thing is in the Shach, sorry, not the Shach, in the Chechas Mechoikik on the spot, in the Shulchan Aruch, and again, the Kufyu test. It says that if one spouse has a debt, a charge on the other, they should not be demanding directly. It should go through a third party, even if there's no yichud involved. That's, one shouldn't be having an engagement in a way that they'll get to bring to yichud. They shouldn't be having any kind of business with one another. There shouldn't be any kind of voluntary engagement with one another, other than it should be after divorce, other than through an intermediary, a shliach. As a result, to the point, if there would be a litigation between one and the other, there would even be punishment in Bezdin. But meanwhile, there should not be a close relationship between divorced husband, man and woman. And I think that to be a Kvater is included in that. But that's as much as I can tell you. Okay, let's move on. What do we have here? Question number 4 is, having eaten milchiks, and now I want to have fleishiks, I need to have a hefsek. Now, does bentsching work for this? Can we? Well, and is it not a question of brocho she'eino sficha? So now, here in Simon Peites in Yeridea. Now, the source of having to have it in a separate meal is from the Zohar Parshas Mishpatim, which says that milk and meat should not be eaten in the same hour, not in the same meal. Therefore, there is an idea of dafka having to withdraw from the first meal before, and then you can go into the next meal. Now, the Ramos says, "V'yesh oimri de'ein levorach birkas haMozon almanas lechel gevina." Bear in mind that the Ashkenazim, or the original Ashkenazi minhag was, you only have to wait an hour after fleishiks before milchiks. So to dafka bench, in order to be able to have after fleishiks, in order to have milchiks, or by us is the other way around, dafka to bench after milchiks in order to be able to do fleishiks. So those to say you should not be doing that. That's one of the Rishonim, I think so, Zerua. But the community generally are not concerned about this, and they do bench in order to break up between fleishiks and milchiks to be able to have the other food shortly after the first one. In the Taz, on the margin here, which I've quoted here in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Taz on the margin of the Shulchan Aruch, he says, what Toisfus in Chulin Daf Kuf Hey says, if you were silek or beirach, if you withdrew from the meal and you benched, and now they brought fresh cream cake, which is milchik, and you decided again that, oh, now I am hungry. Yeah, you change your mind. So then you're allowed to have now the milchiks. But to bench but you're benching, but you're not finished eating. You're only benching because you want to continue eating. He says that's not genuine. he doesn't challenge from the question of unnecessary brocha. He says it's ineffective. It's not a siluk. You haven't withdrawn from eating. You intend to continue eating. That's the Taz. The later Achronim disagree with the Taz, and they justify the ein nizharim, the communal meaning not to be far and to bench in order to. And they say that we find elsewhere that breaking up a meal into two is actually counted as a separate unit. And there's the well-known discussion about breaking up a Shabbos meal by day in order to be able to go to Shalosh Shudas. So it could be an Erev Pesach in the morning, or let's say you only started your meal late and it's a winter afternoon, Shabbos afternoon, not going to be enough time to have a proper Shalosh Shudas. So there's a svara of stopping after the fish and make a Birkas haMozon and then wash again and have your cholent, etc. It's such an opinion. So there you see that it's a separate meal. It's been so as a bentsching makes it a separate meal. Now, that's one issue. Is the Birkas haMozon effective in breaking up the continuity? That's one issue. The other issue is there a question of brocha she'eino tzricha? And here there's a fascinating kuntras achron in Siman Reish Mem Tes. And here the Alter Rebbe analyzes what does it mean brocha she'eino tzricha? Who doesn't need it? Who does need it? What is called a need? And so the precedent of this whole worry about brocha she'eino tzricha is a story of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, where he would do two readings, one from Parshas Achrei, and that would be read from a Sefer Torah. The second reading was Parshas Pinchas in Sefer Bamidbar, and that he would do orally. Normally we don't say words of the written Torah orally, and yet he would. And one of the reasons given is because if you take another Sefer Torah, you'd have to make another brocha because it's a new another item. You'd have to make a brocha she'eino tzricha. So we see there is a concern of a brocha she'eino tzricha. Says the Alter Rebbe that certainly could to the Rosh, brocha she'eino tzricha means for your personal benefit. If it's just tzorchei shamayim, not tzorchei ha'odom, like in the case of the Kohen Gadol, to make another brocha in order to read another from another Sefer Torah, brocha she'eino tzricha. But let's say I love 7-layer chocolate cake. Shmak, between one layer of cake, there's the cream, another one, yeah. So now, but you know what? If you bring me 7-layer chocolate cake between the fish and the chicken soup, I say no, I'm not interested. That's not the time for cream cake. When do I have it? Oh, before the meal. When I'm not during a meal. So now let's say it comes Shabbos, and I make kiddush, and I want to have a piece of chocolate cake, cream cake. I don't want it later. I want it now. As a result, so it's a question of brocha she'eino tzricha. So he says no. That is what you want. That's your the brochas for hanoas ha'odom, and therefore that's okay. That's legitimate. Brocha she'eino tzricha means if it's not needed for hanoas ha'odom. On that basis, I think that if you are making a brocha achrona, in order to now be able to have a new sequence, to be able to have fleishiks or milchas, whatever it may be, but that is tzricha. You want to be the hanoas ha'odom is that you want to have now fleishiks. I think it does fall into the category of brocha hatzricha. There are others who disagree, I know, but that's my understanding according to the Alter Rebbe's definition. I'm in the middle of working on it to get a kolorkite, but I think that would be koref elemis. Meanwhile, someone I gave over this concept at Kinus Torah on Isru Chag by night in Heichel Menachem Golders Green. And meanwhile, someone was asking a question: can you, on a Friday night or Shabbos, can you leave the dessert for after bentsching? Or is it a problem of brocha she'eino tzricha? Why does he want to do it? Because sometimes you have guests who want to go away, and sometimes he gives his wife a chance to be able to prepare the dessert, whatever it may be. For technical reasons, he wants to have the dessert. They want to have the dessert after bentsching. Is it not a question of brocho she'nasricha? Like this, the dessert could have been included in the bentsching, and now it's going to have a separate brocho. So here's a very interesting. This is the last piece in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch Chelik Aleph. Talks about this. The Magen Avraham is not so happy about this, but here the Alter Rebbe, because of brocho she'nasricha, the Alter Rebbe pastors like the Evan Ha'ozer that you are allowed to, and he says the following: if you're going to have, let's say, I have a piece of cake, chocolate cake, and bench, I have another piece of chocolate cake, and with a brocho. That's a brocho she'nasricha. I could have had both pieces with one brocho, but if I'm having one food which is a chosheva food, the other one, if I have it now, it won't have its own brocho because it's toppled to the other one. But if I have it separate, then it will have its own brocho. So he says, let's read it inside. If it is when do we say you should not generate two brochos unnecessarily? When it's one brocho for which works for both of them. But if the brocho is for one, and the other one will only be incorporated, but in a toffel way, in a subsidiary way, then better to break them apart. Have taka two brochos. Therefore, he says in Sifrei, if you were brought a meal, they brought some fruit, and it's actually better to leave for after the meal, because if you have them during the meal, you're not going to make a brocha on the meal on the fruit. They're going to be included in the bentsching, but that's only as a subsidiary, not. It's not for them. It's just that they are toffel to the haMozon. Whereas if you have them afterwards, so then it's going to have its own brocha achrona rather than being incorporated with something else. And therefore, that's not a problem of brocha she'nasricha. That's the shita which Alter Rebbe paskins l'chatchila. V'yesh cholkim. That's the Magen Avraham who disagrees with this, and he says it is a considered brocha she'nasricha. V'yesh lahachmir kesvora harishona, which means that it's better to break them apart. That seems to be the Kvater, especially on Shabbat. If you want to make up your quota of 100 brochos, so then leave the dessert for after bentsching, and as a result, the fruit, you leave them for after bentsching. In this way, you'll be able to make up your mea brochos, rather than having to rely on, for your mea brochos, to rely on chazos hashatz or the brochos of laning and haftorah. This is more straightforward than relying on the chazos hashatz, etc. for mea brochos. So it seems to be quite clear that the Alter Rebbe passes that you are allowed to do this, and it seems to be recommended. Okay. I had a very interesting shaila. One of our listeners of the recording, somewhere in the United States, writes to me this week. He had the following a scenario happened in Shul. In the middle of Birkas Kohanim, the Chazan skipped a word. And so he's prompting the Kohanim, and he skipped a word. He said, Pono, instead of Pono, he said Halocho. And then everyone else is Pono. Then now the Kohanim standing in the front, do they say Halocho because the Chazan said Halocho? Do they say Pono because everyone else is saying Pono? It became the whole confusion. And so what should be done? What should they have done? So I couldn't find this, with all the malaktim, etc. I couldn't find this addressed directly. By me, is a davar poshut that the Kohanim should not have listened to the Chazan, and they should have listened to the other people. Omer lohem means Yisroel tells the Kohen what to say. It doesn't matter which one. It could be anyone. It could be lav dafka the Chazan. But there was now a confusion. What happens when there's such a confusion? I'm judging on the spot, but I would consider possibly saying, you know what? Let's start the pasuk all over again. It's such a confusion. Start all over again, and start from the beginning of that pasuk. That's how, depending on the degree of confusion. If it's just dealt with right away, but if it's the way he seems to have described it, I think you tell them to start again. Now, the source which I have for this is a little bit from Kriyas HaTorah. And I'm just going to share with you what happens with a mistake, if the Bal Koire makes a mistake, when does he go back and when does he not go back? And I'm honest that I'm seeing here stuff which I don't really have a clarity. So we have here the lower quote is from a sefer called Shari Rachamim, which is a commentary on the Shari Ephraim, which is specialized in Sefer Kriyas HaTorah. He says, if the Chazan makes a mistake, could be with his trop or with other mistake, if it's a pasuk where he mentions Hashem's name, he can go back to the beginning of the pasuk, and it's not a problem of saying half a pasuk, because it's going back only because of the choimer, of the severity of saying Hashem's name in vain. I really don't understand what happened here. He's already said Hashem's name and is going back and repeating it. It's really unclear what he's saying here. I don't understand. He quotes the Chai Odom, and the Chai Odom says something totally different. How do I know? The Tzitz Eliezer, which Tzitz Eliezer has in a tshuva in Chelik base, he challenges the Shari Rachamim. Mipasha took the whole Chai Odom and distorted it, but never mind. Meanwhile, I have here two quotes from Sichas of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and one is from the Kutei Diburim, and one is from Chelik of Sefer Sichas Tov Shin Dalet. So now he says the Rabbeim, where this Tov Shin to the Kutei Diburim, the Rabbeim were particular about Kriyas HaTorah. It should be very accurate, and often it would be that the Bal Koire had made a mistake even in one of the Torah, and he would have to repeat the word. On a mol, a halben or a ganze pasuk. Sometimes he would have to repeat a half a pasuk or a whole pasuk. Or nid given can as kore in them pasuk. If there wasn't Hashem's name in the pasuk. So what's he saying? If there was Hashem's name in the pasuk, they wouldn't go back. If there was Hashem's name, they wouldn't go back. That seems to be the drift here. That even if there was a mistake, they wouldn't go back if there was Hashem's name. That's the drift I get over here. I might be wrong, but now I'm looking the second quote from Sefer Sichas Tov Shin Dalet. Here he's talking about the Tzemach Tzedek, that he was particular about Kriyas HaTorah, Trop, etc. Amol Gehasten, he once told the Bal Koire who made a mistake with a Trop, he should repeat again. Hagam as a hot to leave them, that this time he says, even though as the result of the repetition, he had to say Hashem's name again, he still told him to repeat it. So now, if here he's saying that even if there is Hashem's name in the part which you've said with the wrong trop, you still would repeat it and you wouldn't be fazed by the fact that you have to repeat Hashem's name. And what's then the other sikha saying? The impression is that because of Hashem's name there, you wouldn't repeat it. I'm really very confused. And I remember once seeing someone wrote an article to try to explain all of this. I seem to remember it was in the Hiskashrus weekly pamphlet. I wrote to Rabbi Ginsburg. I asked him if he remembers, and he unfortunately didn't remember where it was. So I'm just mystified by this. Okay, let's move on. Someone is asking that before Kriyas HaTorah, we have on Mondays and Thursdays, Keler Chapayim, and on Shabbos, we have adhere sodas. Now, in the Sidurim, the caption here, Seder Hitzor Sefer Torah, is it before adhere or is it before Vahi bin Soya? So there are in the Kahos Sidurim, one sometimes is like this, sometimes like that. His question is Keler Chapayim got to do with Kriyas HaTorah, or is it just got to do with Mondays and Thursdays? And I answered him that definitely it's a preamble to Kriyas HaTorah. To the point that I would say that, I'm sharing with you that the Avud Arham says that on a Tanis Tzibur, which is not necessarily on a Monday or Thursday. So although the Alter Rebbe here says, no, it's not, I don't have it here. Although the Alter Rebbe does say, Sheni v'chamishi, Most of the times, it's Keler Chapayim. In the weekdays, it's Keler Sheni V'Chamishi, but it could be also on a Tanis. If it's on a Tuesday, Wednesday, also. Let's read inside. This is the Abu Darham. 3 quotes from different places. Okay. Then we have, this is a second place. And this is in Shabbos, I think. Clearly, it's got to do with Etzah Sefer Torah. Here's a very interesting one. Here about Purim, he says, very interesting. He's saying on Purim, because you're not going to say Tachnun, therefore you're not going to say Keler Chapayim, so say Ata Horesa instead. That I'm sure is not Araminic. Such a big Chiddush we would have heard about. But what do you do on a Tanis? Do you say Keler Chapayim? I don't have enough evidence to say no. And I would say it's Kriyas HaTorah in the weekdays, so you say Tachnun, so one should. Here is the comparing 2 prints. This is a contemporary print of the Chabad Siddur. Here's the original print, the Shkolov Tov Samel Gimel. You can see there's no captions at all. There's no caption above Atareso and no caption before Vahim Soya. So this caption over here, Seder Soa Sefer Torah, this is of a later publisher, and it's not really binding, and definitely Atareso Ladas. It has to do with Kriyas HaTorah, and if you're not having Kriyas HaTorah, you don't say Atareso Ladas. Nova HaPoshut. Masha Ein Kain, the Posuk Vanis Filosi, which we say on Shabbos afternoon, that is clearly not to do with Kriyas HaTorah, and clearly looking at the Rebbe Siddur, the wording over there, that if for whatever reason there's no there's no Sefer Torah, you'd still say Vanis Filosi, but in that case, he says you should say Vanis Filosi before the Kaddish. In other words, before the, again, I'm going too fast, perhaps. If there's no Sefer Torah at Shabbos Mincha, so then you go of Volotzion, Kaddish, straight into Shemon Esrei. There's only one Kaddish. If that's the case, Vanis Filosi should be said, Yaglu Torah v'Yadir, Vanis Filosi, and then Yizgadol is Kaddish. Why so? Because after the Kaddish, before Shemon Esrei, one shouldn't be mafsik. One shouldn't be mafsik with other things, because the Kaddish should go straight into Shemon Esrei, which I know I'm getting into a minefield, because there's a whole parsha. What do you do with your Halalu? What do you do by Shabbos Mincha? When do you say it? But to say it after Kaddish, before Shemon Esrei, is difficult, because the Shulchan Aruch, the Rebbe says clearly, Banis Filosi should not be said then, because of Hefsek. So the pasuk of Yahalalu is also Hefsek. So I really, that's a mystery on its own, which I haven't managed to resolve. Let's move on. Okay, a couple of weeks ago, I shared with you about some fellow who suggested about this Racha and the difference between Racha Meitzit Koscho and Nusach Ashkenaz having Racha Meim Tzit Koscho. I shared with you that the Racha Meim is an innovation of Yitzchok of Satanov, who was a maskil, and somehow it's crept into some Ashkenaz Sidurim, but it's really not the original format. Meanwhile, since then, my cousin, Falik Strauss, who's a shliach in Vancouver, he got very excited about this thing. He's done a lot of research about Ona B'Choyach, and he's shared with me how you can see on the left is his table exploring the Esespheres, and he's got very interesting contemporary translations of the Esespheres rather than the more common wording which is used. For example, he has Das is conviction, Tiferes is a harmony, or a firmness, not might, etc. At any rate, his position is the following. We've got the 6 words of Ona B'Choyach. We've got 7 sentences corresponding to Chesed Gvur Tiferes Netzach Hod Yesod Malchus. That's Poshet. It corresponds to the 7 midas. Then the 6 words are corresponding within each line, corresponding to Chesed Gvur Tiferes, and then Netzach Hod Yesod. And then the abbreviation is Malchus. Okay. And what he's explaining to me is the following: that between Tiferes and Hod, Tiferes and Netzach, there is a natural flow. After the stage of Tiferes, there is a a draw to go on to the next stage, to go into from midas into ma'aser, with the exception of midas hagvura. With midas hagvura, there's actually, it's desirable that there should be a pause between the emotion and the implementation. So the chesed gvura tiferes is the emotion, netzach hod yesod is the implementation. There should be a pause between them, and therefore he says, look at the 7 lines. Of the 6 out of the 7, the 2 middle words corresponding to tiferes and netzach are naturally connected. The one which is clearly separated is the second line by Gvura. Accept the song of your people, exalt us, purify us, O awesome one. So he's saying that this is very precise, that dafke on the second line, which is corresponding to Gvura, there is a necessary pause between the 3rd and the 4th word. Masha'enkein, in the 4th line, which corresponds to Nidus HaNetzach, between Rachamei and Tzidkoscho, there's no need for a pause. The contrary, it should be flowing. And therefore, whoever came up with this idea of changing for Rachamei to Rachameim was obviously unaware of the Kabbalah Kavonis of this shtickle of davening. Okay, that's what I have to share with you for this evening, and I apologize for ending a little bit earlier, but I wish you all a good Shabbos, and we should hear Besuras Tovis, Refuis, Nechomis, Yeshuas, and Simchas Olam Al Rishom, Gula Shlemo, Mashiach Tzedkenu. We learned today in Gemara about Eliyahu Hanavi not coming on a Friday or on a Shabbos, not to bother people with distract them from their preparation of the Cholent. Whatever takes the view, it can come even on a Friday and even on the Shabbos. And these problems we'll be able to solve then also. Once, I just finished off. One time Reb Chaim Gutnik was by the Rebbe, and there was a question. So the Rebbe said, he asked something about Moshiach. So when Moshiach will come, the Rebbe says he'll answer this question. So Rabbi Chaim Gutnik asks, but isn't it Eliyahu Hanavi's job to answer all the questions? Tishbi, Teiku stands for Tishbi Yitarz Kushas Reiboyes. Aha. So the Rebbe said, oh, the Shailot Moshiach Echet Verentfen. The Shailot, but I see someone's pointed out, I missed out question 9. Yes, so this happened to me just yesterday morning. The Chazan was slightly ahead of me, and so I was just finishing Oz Yoshir, and he was about to say Kaddish after Yishtabach. So I stopped there with the intention that after I answered Brocho, I will say Yishtabach. But just after I answered Brocho, by kind of automatically, I went and instead said Baruch Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. And oops, I realized, what do I do now? I can't, it's a brocho levatolo to cancel that one, yeah. So fortunately, I have next to my place in Shul, I have this 2-volume set called Shgiyos Miyovin. So there and then I pulled out the Sefer and I found there's 3 opinions. So basically, what do you do here? You should have said Yishtabach, and by mistake you skipped Yishtabach. You started Yotzer Or. So one says you lost it. You can't say Yishtabach later. The other one says Shei Yishtabach. You owe a Yishtabach, so you can pay that debt between Ben HaProkim. So what I did was actually I followed that opinion, and after Yotzer HaMoiris, before Avos Olam, I put in the Yishtabach over there. The third opinion is to say after Shemona Esrei, you'll say a bit of Tehillim and say Yishtabach then. So I didn't have time to go through all of those shittas, but certainly, we had also in Gemara yesterday about Hachroa. There are 3 opinions. So I think the one who says that you should say it seems to be a middle opinion, and so we can follow the middle opinion. Okay, so that's it for now. And again, we should be Shabbos and Simchas and Gesund and Geula. Kol Tov.